Wonderful. We have about nearly 70 people on online, and it's absolutely a delight to have all of you with us today. Good afternoon, everyone. We are most delighted to have with us Jaya Dhindor with us today for the CPR CSH Urban Workshop Series. Welcome, Jaya. I am Champaka Rajagopal, a fellow at Center for Policy Research. My work focuses on urban policy, governance, planning, and regulation. I've had the wonderful opportunity to know Jaya for over a decade through the many policy and planning efforts we've been involved in across cities in India. I would say the one thing that I've really enjoyed in knowing Jaya is that on every assignment or effort we've been involved in, we've had very fierce debates. And that's how I've known Jaya as someone who's really solid and has great levels of rigor that she brings in her work. We're absolutely delighted to have you with us today, Jaya. Jaya is an urban strategist with over 2 decades of global experience in sustainable cities, climate resilience, mobility, and urban planning. As Executive Director of Sustainable Cities at World Resources Institute India, she leads cross-cutting initiatives that integrate data, policy, and multi-level governance to drive inclusive urban transformations. Jaya has worked with governments, academia, and private firms across India and the United States, including the city of Charlotte, and with the Indian Institute of Sciences at Bangalore. A systems thinker and a published author, she holds degrees in architecture, city planning from the Indian Institute of Technology, Kharagpur, and environment policy from the University of Cincinnati in the United States. She serves as managing associate editor for the Journal of Sustainable Urbanization Planning and Progress. Welcome again, Jaya. We are really looking forward to your talk today, which is on climate action plans. I know that over 2 decades of my own work in the field of urban planning, we know how difficult it has been to garner political commitment to plans. And I'd say that, your work in advancing climate action plans across multiple cities of varying governance capacities in India has really been to garner political commitment and political sort of interest and commitment. So that's fantastic. And your presentation today offers a comparative analysis of climate action plans across cities like Mumbai, Bengaluru, Nashik, and Patan, drawing on WRI India's multi-city engagement processes. It highlights how megacities like Mumbai benefit from stronger political mandates, institutional capacities, and formal data systems, while smaller or mid-sized cities like Nashik or Patan operate more in a resource-constrained, adaptive, and often locally embedded contexts. These are very different kinds of strengths and sort of challenges each of these cities bring. And one of the key challenges that we all face is governance autonomy for cities with varying capacities. And so these variations lead to divergent processes, orientations from technocratically led consultant-driven planning to more iterative, locally owned approaches. And both are important for us to be exposed to in terms of the dynamics you've experienced in your practice work. The presentation attempts to unpack who drives climate action plans, how tools are adapted, and what happens post the planning process. Ultimately, climate action plans reflect not just climate intent, but also the institutional readiness and political economy of cities, each shaped by its scale and context. We're all really looking forward to this because urban planning critique in India so far has really largely been on 2 trajectories. One, which is focused on informalization of decisions in India, and the other, which is focused on why state-market relations need to be strengthened in order for markets and states to actually be able to respond to one another in urban planning processes. Today, we're actually, and so far, both these trajectories have solicited greater political commitment. And today we're working, today we're going to listen to you on climate action plans, which have actually worked with both administrators, political agents, as well as civil society organizations. I myself have been part of many of these workshops with you all. So we're going to see a very different kind of a process, and we're excited about this. So over to you, Jaya. Welcome again.
First of all, Champaka, thank you very much. It's always lovely to be on platforms with you, carrying forward our debates and discussions. And this one is particularly interesting. We have been working on climate action plans since pretty much 2021. Right in the middle of the COVID pandemic, is when we started. And we started with Mumbai, which was the first ever city to develop a climate action plan in India. And since then, we have worked at different scales of these climate action plans. And, it was interesting when we reached the fork in the road to say, okay, what is working and what isn't? And should we be doing more of these? Is this the right way to go? Could these kind of create the strategic templates that cities need beyond sort of statutory master plans to be able to affect, implementation and actual good pathways and solutions in cities? So really after we had that conversation, Champaka, about, what can I talk about, this was one of the ideas, and so we've just kind of put this together. This is a 4-city comparative between Mumbai, Bengaluru, Nashik, and Patan. Just to let everyone know that the work on Patan is still sort of ongoing. So these are all sort of preliminary learnings that we are kind of coming at from the field, but very happy to share them here. It was very interesting, actually, even compiling this, as that there are extensive teams which have worked on each of these plans. It is not an overnight thing. They have taken many, many years, and a lot of blood, sweat, and tears in the real sense. And so it was wonderful putting this comparative analysis together. I will share my screen now. And again, Champaka, thank you very much for inviting me for this conversation. And just to preserve bandwidth, I will turn off my camera, but if you think my internet is unstable at any point, or if you can't hear me, or if there's a lag, please let me know and I'll switch networks. I'm sorry, I'm operating from home today, so yeah, I have access issues. All right. Please let me know when this is visible.
We can see your screen, Jaya.
All right, fantastic. So, to start with, where did we start, and, where have we come to on climate action plans? Really, it started with sort of, the Paris Agreement. And essentially in 2015, the world coming together saying we want to make some commitments and we want countries to commit to sort of moving towards net zero emissions. Of course, India kind of took on the mantle in 2021, made a bold statement and some quite progressive sort of ambitious sort of targets on what they wanted to achieve with respect to climate action. That's when we came onto the stage. We already committed to 500 gigawatts of renewables, for example, and we're doing really well in that sector, right? So, despite of coal kind of being the primary source of energy, we have also committed to that. We made some big, bold commitments, but we also did it a little bit cognizant of our economic ambitions. So when you look at the graph down there, when you see that India overall, yes, it is the 4th largest emitter, but at the same time, when you look at the per capita emissions, we are really low. And China at that point committed to 2060. We said 2070 is what we are going to stick to, although the Paris Agreement called for 2050. But there were small cities, besides the metropolitan and the usual cast of characters that you would suspect would kind of sign on and jump at the opportunity to start taking action. Cities like Nashik actually also signed pledges like the Race to Zero, which meant they're going to do actions which accelerate the net zero transitions. So from WRI's perspective, these are sort of the 6 cities in India where we worked on climate action plans. Mumbai was the first one, and then it was closely followed by Bengaluru. Yes?
Can you just make your presentation full screen mode?
That is what I was just telling Champaka, that the full screen is a challenge for me. It doesn't go full screen.
All right.
Let me... Are things visible? Just...
Yes.
Is this better?
It's better. I think, yeah, you can...
Yes, it's better.
It's better? Okay. All right.
Slideshow, it will come full screen. Jaya, do slideshow.
Yeah, so I can do slideshow, but then what happens is my screen completely blacks out. That is the problem.
Okay.
So then I can't see what slides I'm on. Yeah,
okay.
apologies.
Yeah, it's good.
Apologies for that. It's some glitch with my system, but okay. Let me know if I need to make this bigger, or is this any better? Yeah, is this working?
Yes, you can go ahead. Yeah, it's fine.
All right, great. All right, so basically WRI India's roadmap on climate action plan started really with Mumbai, which was the first city which took on the mantle of doing the climate action plan. And it was, an interesting conversation where, because we were engaging with the city on an initiative called Cities for Forest, which was looking at reinstating blue-green infrastructure in the city, ways to do flood management and other things, and heat management. They called us and they said, hey, we need to do climate action plan because we are a C40 city. It is a mandate, that we have to complete this. Can you all help us do this? And, 3 months time. And we were like, sure, we can help do this and be a knowledge partner, but 3 months time is not going to be adequate if you're going to do this in proper ways. And I'll tell you sort of stories around what happened in each of these cities as we move along. But Mumbai was the first one. Bengaluru followed shortly afterwards because it was also a C40 network city. C40 network cities and those in India which have signed up to those, including Delhi, Kolkata, Ahmedabad. These are the other cities, and Chennai. Basically have a mandate to complete climate action plans by a certain date to be able to retain their membership of the network. And so that was sort of the prerogative of why these plans started. Then Nashik, Aurangabad, and Solapur. At the time in Maharashtra, we had a very progressive leader, Aditya Thackeray, who himself comes from an environmental planning background. He was very interested in mainstreaming climate action planning in cities. And so they wanted to do a climate action plan in each division of Maharashtra. Maharashtra has 6 divisions. And they said, we want to do a plan in each division. Nashik, Aurangabad, Solapur came about. And then there has been a trajectory ever since. We'll talk about that, and I'll talk about Nashik as one of the representative mid-sized cities. Patan, interestingly, came about because Tata Trusts has been working in the city for a while now on housing, on sort of resilience and those kind of things, and essentially through a partner called Mahila Housing Trust. And essentially they came to us and, they said that we would like to develop a climate action plan for Patan. Patan is a very different scale size of a city, and I'll tell you more about it later. But this kind of a plan over there has been really largely quote unquote consultant led, where, MHD is kind of the primary engagement partner, and then we are again acting as knowledge partners. So this is how all the plans have come about. Now, just to kind of lay the grounds for, what is climate action plan and how did we see it? So essentially it was targeting 3 things, 4 things really. So one was emissions neutrality. So what are the pathways to get to net zero by 2050? Second was resilience to climate hazards. How can cities adapt better and improve their resilience to the climate hazards they are exposed to? The third one was around governance and collaboration, because these plans were not going to be statutory. What are the governance and institutional mechanisms needed to kind of get them into the mainstream to ensure that all the agencies, all the actors are doing their bit to kind of take this forward? One of the things that we did add to the process was inclusivity and benefits. So outlining not just the environmental and economic imperatives, but also looking at the socioeconomic dynamics of where these cities were and how can the trajectories and the pathways that we talk about take them towards more positive transformations. So I'll start with Mumbai, and what I'll do is I'll give you a quick comparative between the 4 cities, and then I'll talk about the learnings that we have had, some of the similarities, differences, and what can policymakers do. So with Mumbai, just to kind of, familiarize folks, the context is this, right? We're talking about one of the largest megapolitan areas in India, with one of the highest population densities. So we are talking about a city which is about 437 odd square kilometers and has these kind of densities. It also has a very high rate of people living in slums, a high percentage of people living in slums. There are also a lot of informal settlements, and there are a lot of the SRA type of settlements, the RNR and the rehabilitated people who have been moved to certain wards in the city, and there is all that. So the urbanization context is this, right? That when we look at the 50-kilometer radius outside of Mumbai, from the center of Mumbai, a lot of growth has been accruing outside the municipal limits. This is typical for all cities, and this is data till 2015. We have actually updated this to reflect 2022 realities, but this is just to show, what is the kind of growth that is happening outside of the built area. This was the climate sort of the GHG emissions kind of picture of the city. When we look at it overall, there were three sort of major sectors when we were looking at the greenhouse gas emissions baseline inventory. And so stationary energy, which accounts for all buildings and industries, construction, commercial, residential, all kinds of buildings, accounts for the highest percentage of total emissions. This is not surprising. It's actually the case in most of the cities. So in Mumbai, the share was about 72%. The total GHG emissions were in the range of 23 million tons CO2 equivalent. And I will tell you, how those ranges then change when you go from one city to another, depending on the scale of the city. Transport was the next emitting source, and then the third was the waste. We looked at climate hazards that impact the city. So overall, there are about 12 climate hazards that we looked at, across all the geographies. These were the ones which were most relevant in the case of Mumbai: urban heat, air quality, landslides, urban flooding, and coastal risk. This is just to give you a picture of, the kind of analysis, the data analysis that we did from satellite imagery. To say that, these are the kind of differences that exist between formal, informal settlements. And, when we look at landslide prone areas, this was also to kind of highlight differential vulnerabilities, to say that, landslides happen. There are about 287 locations across Greater Mumbai which are prone to landslides, but 209 or 10 out of those are within informal settlements. So this was to highlight the differential vulnerabilities. When we look at, things like flooding, which is a reality in all of our cities, really. So we were looking at, these events which have been kind of localized for the longest time. Basically, since 2017, Mumbai has seen an increase in extremely heavy rainfall events, and the rainfall events have been erratic. And so there have been more days and more cases and increasing vulnerability to flooding in the city. Now, just a note about the governance systems, and this is how it sits. And I'm talking about the municipal corporation because that was the anchoring agency for the climate action plan. So the administrative wing is headed by, which is the municipal corporation, is headed by, a municipal commissioner. He has 4 AMCs under him, additional municipal commissioners: Eastern Suburbs, Western Projects, and City. And I'll come to this later, but the Climate Action Cell now sits within the AMC Western's jurisdiction, which is within the Environment Department, headed by DMC. And that kind of reports to the AMC as well. So the thing is that, these positions keep changing, or the location of these departments, interestingly, in the case of Mumbai, keep changing, depending on the portfolio size. So you would say that, why doesn't climate action planning and environment sit with AMC City? Well, the reason being that he has, much larger sort of substantial portfolios in value. And so therefore they kind of keep moving things around. So this is just to make that point. And 2024 was when they institutionalized an independent environment and climate change department, going beyond just the recommendation of a climate action cell in the city. And I'll come to that later. Also, just to make a note here for those who are not aware, that Mumbai, the municipal corporation is one of the richest in India. It has, the most amount of money. And they're also the ones who spend the most amount of money on their infrastructure development and planning India-wide. A point on data inputs, because this is an important consideration for how we went about doing the GHG inventories, doing the baseline assessments on vulnerability. And this basically was, so basically it's emissions, urban planning, geomorphology, the hydrometeorological data, environmental data, and you can see the kind of data sets that were extracted from that. When we look at data inputs and tools, the sources were coming from city agencies, from state agencies, and also national level agencies. And it was a compilation of all of that. The data sources I've kind of listed here to give you a sense of, the number of agencies that we had to make contact with to kind of get this data. The quality of the data received in the case of Mumbai was reasonable. Not that it did not have gaps and it didn't require manipulations, it was reasonable. We have a whole assessment of the kind of, the data discrepancies that existed, the kind of innovations that we had to bring in, the kind of limitations that were there that we had to kind of put in. But this is just to give you a sense of what that was. For example, on the limitations, data from monitoring stations was often inconsistent. It was hard to fill the data gaps given geographic distribution of stations within the city boundary. So since we were really constricted to the municipal corporation boundary, sometimes, these stations exist outside of that, but, how do you work with the ones that exist within that geography? And that sometimes posed a challenge. One of the important innovations and that happened through the process was the creation of the climate hazard vulnerability assessment framework. So just to say that, on the right, if you look at the diagram, the climate action planning has two parts. So one is mitigation focused, basically, which focuses on creating the GHG baselines and inventory. The second is adaptation and looking at sort of vulnerability assessments, exposure, sensitivities, and adaptive capacities of the populations that live in the cities. And there are numerous tools through which you can arrive at some of these numbers. For GHG inventories, for the first time, and that was the whole point, was that we used a global standards, the GPC, and a CIRRUS tool, which was developed by C40 cities to kind of do the emissions inventory and baseline. There was also the vulnerability assessment, which, C40 had their own CCRA, tool, but that was too generic. And we felt that this especially needs to be very granular with local requirements and sensitivities plugged in. And so WRI India developed our own climate hazard vulnerability assessment framework, which is super detailed and talks about differential vulnerabilities for the first time in the Indian context. And so these were used, and then the RCP analysis, which is from this, IPCC, which essentially is representative concentration paths, which talks about various scenarios that you may end up with in terms of GHG concentrations in the future. So this is, it's not a hard and fast, it's a modeling tool, but it is interesting to see the kind of outputs that produced. So in the case of Mumbai, the sectoral plans and strategies that emerged were along these lines. These were the 6 sort of sectors that we tackled. One note here that, for all the plans that we made, we basically went with sectors. And the question that naturally arises is why? Because climate action really needs coordination across agency and has to solve intersectoral problems. And that we recognize. But I think what we also recognized is that unless you had a department or an agency to pin responsibilities on, things would not get done. The fact that this was not a statutory document and would not be was enough of a problem in itself. And so that's why we went with these sectors. What followed on, and this is, what happened next in terms of, WRI India's engagement and what the city did. One was transforming the ways that electrification of transport was happening in the city, the speed and the scale of it. An EV cell was launched, EV charging infrastructure plans were kind of developed for the city level, and these toolkits were developed. And also, we were supporting the electrification of bus-based, public transport, and BEST has therefore introduced, electric buses in the city. The other thing was basically looking at transforming approaches to greening. The city and the gardens department, along with other private actors, CSR units, were spending a lot on urban greening. So basically planting trees. And it was devoid of local context. It was devoid of sort of realities, scientific ways in which to go about doing this, which meant that every time the city flooded, the saplings that you had planted or whatever you had done would come undone. And that was it was a waste of effort, money, everything. And so the idea was, how can we bring scientific thinking into the ways in which these approaches are being carried out, looking at soil species match, bringing in ecologists, landscape architects, and other experts to help with, figuring out how this can be done in a more cogent way, so that, these efforts can be, optimal in terms of their efficiency and their cost efficiency, but also they can they can be done in the right way without sort of, again, including exotic species and going in that direction. And many things had to happen for this to come together. So on the one hand, there were campaigns and coalitions which were working on this. There was, Radio Mirchi, interestingly, who took on this campaign. There were other private actors who took this on and basically started understanding the value of, approaches to greening, which would be more scientific. The third thing that really happened was the city transforming their approach to flood management. Now, in Mumbai and in all other cities, typically the flood management approach is identify the hotspots, the areas which are flooded, and figure out band-aid, treatments for those hotspot locations. Maybe it's cleaning of the drainage or doing some solid waste management or whatever it is, just kind of doing this hotspot management. And the idea was that how can we look at a more holistic catchment-wide planning and flood risk management, which looks at geospatial data, and through pilot projects, but also looks at, hydrogeology and other things and other considerations which were really needed to manage, the flooding situation better. There was a lot of work done around this, and now at least there is recognition that, the hotspot approach is not going to work. We really need to look beyond that. The other ways in which things happened were through pilot projects, which we and others enabled. One was looking at strategic projects at the ecology level of, say, Amethi River, and how can you reduce the urban flooding and shift the practice from treating it as a flood again hotspot issue to a more catchment-based approach. And how can you introduce nature-based solutions as a way and floodable landscapes as a way to look at what is happening around this ecology. The second was, looking at, again, rehabilitation, resettlement colonies, the R&R colonies. A large portion of Mumbai's population lives in those. There are entire wards which have a large, a portion of their population who are in R&R colonies. And again, the whole idea was that how can we bring nature-based solutions, permeability? These places get flooded very easily. And when these places get flooded, it's a livelihood, productivity, health, just all kinds of issues for these people. And so the idea was, can you create first practices in these kind of communities, which are landlocked and which have very little space, but how can you create sponge infrastructure and network capacity? There were micro actions that also happened across educational campuses, universities, municipal schools. There were these small sort of accelerator programs that we put in place to say, what are good practices on nature-based solutions to kind of prevent flooding, heat, and all of that. One of the schools, which was the Scouts and Guides, did a wonderful transformation of their common areas. And for the first time, these children got to experience and got an outdoor learning environment where they were learning things that they were previously just learning in textbooks. There were some rooftop gardening initiatives, and then the municipal corporation then, found these initiatives to be interesting enough to say that they are going to allocate budget to scale this up to about 250 schools in Mumbai. There was also work that happened within vulnerable communities. Again, these small kind of, interventions with the idea of, if you look at the map, the satellite image at the bottom with those green networks, the idea was that you can't get all of this in a very dense, congested, informal colony situation altogether. But how can you do this, in a way which leads to incremental sort of positive things happening on the ground? So those happened. Marol Forest and some of those interventions were also put into place. Now, a lot of this required a huge amount of stakeholder consultation, whether it was consultations with experts, with architects, ecologists, or with sort of neighborhood residents, and kind of bringing them along, including, children, the youth, vulnerable groups. And all of this was done through a highly consultative process. And, we have also been trying to monitor what these actions yield to, because often the criticism is that, nature-based solutions, kind of interventions that you do on the ground, you just do them and you leave, but then, can you monitor the impact? This is a sampling of the kind of things that we've monitored. But, for example, when we are talking about, things like saplings planted or potential affluence treated, or the recharge potential, there are many sort of sub-indicators under each of these. The next thing is, the important part was the institutionalization of the climate action cell. And this is what we had recommended through the climate action plan, that you need a climate action cell, needs to be a chief scientist, a chief planner, and then, these sort of these sort of sections under them on environment protection, knowledge innovation, landscape vulnerable communities, building mobility, finance, all of that. So basically, this was the recommendation that we had made for the institutionalization of the Climate Action Cell. And this is basically how the department has pretty much panned out now that they have consolidated it as a department. There are about 50 positions in the department that are opened up now. And so now the whole climate change cell or the climate change department is a reality and is working on sort of many things in the city. One of them being the climate budget. This is another thing that we helped the city with. After Oslo and some of the international cities, again, Mumbai was the first city ever to develop a climate budget. And this was an extremely important exercise for the city to understand that, what kind of actions are they doing or what kind of budget allocations are they making. And these are budget allocations which are non-salary. They were basically focused on revenue and, capital expenditures to say that, what kind of budgets are aligned with the climate action plan recommendations and how can you make these budgets more aligned. So in the initial parts, we found that, 9% of the budgets on certain things were like highly climate relevant. About 13% was, possibly aligned to the climate action recommendations. And then in 24-25, that has increased to about 32%, which means a third of BMC's budget, which is about $1.2 billion, is now climate aligned, climate action aligned. And there were insights that we derived from sort of these climate budget exercises. These are the kind of insights to say that 75% of the gardens budget, gardens department budget has the potential for scientific greening. 30% is allocated for beautification of streets. How can you make that more effective? 0.1 of the budget is allocated for participatory and public governance-based implementation. So these were some of the insights that we gleaned from the climate budget exercise. And here is how then the budget templates panned out, right? And you may not be able to see this very well, but typically, the budget templates are the first sort of couple of rows and columns. The last two columns on alignment with MCAP action track and description of intended work was something that they finally included as part of the climate budget. So all of the investments that they were making, the revenues that they were receiving, they had to record this along with it. And of course, this is not perfect in terms of the description of the intended work. So then WRI made further suggestions on how these descriptors can be made more relevant. So in summary, just to say in Mumbai that a lot of actions happened since the plan and post the plan. A greening handbook, for example, was developed to say that if me as an individual citizen or at a neighborhood level, at a block level, at the city level, if we want to do greening, how do we go about doing that while preserving sort of the ecological integrity of the city? And so Mumbai Greening Handbook was kind of developed, taking that into cognizance. And of course, the next thing that happened, like I said, was that once Mumbai was done, the imperative was to move towards 3 other cities in the state, in Maharashtra. And I'll come to those later. Next on Bangalore, again, this was started in 2022, closely on the heels of Mumbai. Again, about the city, about 10 million population. This is the area of BBMP. So compare that to, Mumbai, which is 430 square kilometers. BBMP, the municipal area is quite large. Again, Bangalore had faced a huge increase in population and built up area since 1985. And a lot of that built up area is in the peripheries, and I'll show you the impacts of that. The major economic sectors, high-tech services sector is the major economy. And what we did note is that in terms of, inclusivity or, the excluded groups rather, migrant laborers are a significant part of the population working in the informal sector who don't have voice, who don't have visibility, but often come from places which are facing, climate risks. And then they come to the city, and then they again find themselves in highly precarious situations in areas which are facing other kinds of climate risks. So this is the build footprint evolution, across Bangalore. This is till 2019. So you can just see how the city has expanded. The core literally is hollowing out, and all of the orange red is where all of the new development is coming, aided by a lot of MNCs and other kind of jobs kind of going into the peripheries where development is easier. So similarly over here, we kind of looked at the environmental and the climate risks that Bangalore was most faced with. Urban heat island, intuitively, you don't kind of correlate Bangalore with that, but we did realize that this is actually becoming a big problem, especially in the peripheries. And then, of course, there was the drought. I mean, drought rather than drought, I would say water scarcity, but drought-like situation in Bangalore, because the water here is groundwater here is extremely overexploited. And then there was the flooding situation. And so in Bangalore, it's very common to find areas of Bangalore which are flooded, and then areas of Bangalore which are facing water stress. So 21% of the Bangalore's population is housed on floodplains. Like I said, a lot of these migrant workers, they come from precarious conditions of climate risk, and then they land up in Bangalore and in areas of other kind of climate risks. This is where they end up living in low-lying areas. Groundwater, Bangalore is heavily dependent beyond Kaveri on its groundwater. There's a huge amount of extraction that is happening in the area, leading to these occasional sort of spots of water scarcity also, because we don't manage our water really well. And then the other that, because of the built up, and this is not just true for Bangalore, but a lot of cities, that, there are huge areas in Bangalore which otherwise would have formed very good percolation functions, but now have no groundwater recharge potential because they're highly concretized. So one of the assessments that we did found that 80%, 85% of the floodplains in Bangalore are encroached upon. And so it's no surprise that the recharge potential of the groundwater has decreased, but a lot of the people sort of also live on these encroached floodplains. And so you have 100 mm of rain over a couple of hours, and the city and parts of the city are inundated. A different kind of analysis, which we did for everything, but I just wanted to show it here, is, social, like I said, the part of the CAP was also to focus on socioeconomic issues. And so we were looking at access to hospitals in the city. And we found that while access to hospitals in general or healthcare was relatively high, but only 32% of the city's population had access to government-sponsored healthcare facilities with the kind of standard response time that you would look at. So what this does, and why this is important, is that when you correlate this with, for example, areas that flood or areas that have poor drainage, that tells you the health burden that you can expect in the city, and therefore the things that you need to plan for those populations, again, to become more resilient. GHG emissions baselines, Mumbai 23.4, Bangalore 18.7, again, stationary energy kind of contributing a large chunk of these emissions, followed by transport and waste. Again, similarly, the priority sectors were across sectors and across departments. And then the approach, again, was highly consultative. In the case of Bangalore, there were about 40 plus departments and agencies that were kind of accessed for data, to access data. And then there were several interactions that were held with experts, with parastatal agencies, and at zonal levels, to kind of bring about not just the challenges, but also to kind of spell out the targets. In terms of the governance structure, something recently has happened in Bangalore, which, in case you're aware or if you're following the news, for the first time, I think, in one of the cities in India, everything has been sort of brought under the chief minister. So now Bangalore, which previously had sort of the same system, you have the mayor, but the administrative head is the municipal commissioner, and you have the BBMP. But there was a recent passage of a Greater Bengaluru Governance Act, which got passed like just last month. And what that means is that, one, Bangalore will be divided into multiple corporations. But on the flip side, all the parastatals that operated in the city with different jurisdictions, different kind of mandates, and different service provisioning capacities and qualities will now come under the Greater Bengaluru Authority, which has been set up. So all of these functions come under the Greater Bengaluru Authority. It is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, you're looking at what this means in terms of just going in the opposite direction of decentralization. But because these parastatals and all of the agencies will now be reporting centrally, the hope is that things take shape in a certain form and decisions are made which are better than before. Again, data set inputs. So, looking at similar sort of data set inputs, and again, not to go through this, but just to say that, there are a bunch of data sets which were, accessed in order to just do sort of some of these baseline assessments. And when we look at sort of data inputs and tools, again, these are the sources. At the agency, state and national levels, the quality of the data received had to be manipulated. So it was the classic case of having PDFs where you needed Excel files and so on and so forth to be able to do something with it. And there were some more sort of serious gaps in data, in terms of continuity of data from a certain period to another. And in the case of Bangalore, one of the things which was quite challenging was that we had to sign a lot of non-disclosure agreements to receive this data from various departments, which means that this data could not be shared with any other agency or kind of be used for external partnerships on anything that would happen. And that kind of remains a challenge. Innovations were sort of use of sources such as Google Environmental Insights Explorer, where we didn't have data, we went to other different sources, we used proxies. And again, this followed the method of looking at the CIRRUS tool and then looking at the climate hazard vulnerability assessment that we had developed. It also looked at pathways. Again, pathways is a very sort of mathematical tool that looks at future emission reduction scenario, but it's not really realistic and grounded in any reality because the kind of things that you have to do kind of it doesn't add up. Again, there were these number of actions. There were about 250 actions, 266 actions that were proposed across all of these tracks. There were strategies to reduce emissions for each of the sectors, and then there were strategies for tackling climate hazards as well. In the case of Bangalore, three most important things were urban flooding, water scarcity, and urban heat. So then the BCAP was launched in 2023, and there were major announcements made by the Deputy Chief Minister. One was the launch of the Bengaluru Climate Action Cell, so there was no gap, they launched it immediately, and something else called the launch of the Blue Green Uru initiative. And I'll tell you a little bit about that. But basically what they have done since is BBMP has restructured a few of its existing departments. There was forest, lakes, gardens, and all of that to kind of combine them to form the Forest, Environment and Climate Change Management department as a first action. And the second was basically they constituted a climate action cell within this department with the special commissioner chairing the climate action cell. So Blue Green Uru, and the whole point was that Bangalore is known as the Garden City. Some of the work that we did, the analysis that we put forward demonstrated how a lot of the blue green infrastructure had been lost. Like I said, 85% of the floodplains encroached upon and so on and so forth. So the idea was that, that is an immediate area of action that we need to do in order to kind of ensure climate resilience in the city. And so these were the set of actions which now the Climate Action Cell has started to take. The other thing that was really good that happened is the Friends of Climate Action Cell, because people wanted to engage with the climate action. Bangalore, unlike many other places, has an extremely active civic society and citizenry. And so they created a Friends of Climate Action Cell where you could go in with ideas, find partners, collaborators, and work with them towards certain issues, whether it's lake rejuvenation or anything else. They established a fellowship program. And the idea was that how can these fellows help accelerate some of the ward level actions that need to be taken. Things like, blue-green awards have been instituted by the cell to encourage neighborhoods to look at, improving their blue-green assets in their neighborhoods. A big focus that came in as an intersectional focus for JEDC and inclusion, because this wasn't there in the original sort of sectors with the Climate Action Cell. Given the inputs that they received, the kind of inputs on migrant workers, informality, have added JEDC as an eighth sector as well. Another thing that went on was that about 28 wards were given about 1 crore funds each to look at how can they improve the blue-green infrastructure within their wards. Steering committee, technical committees are being formed, which consist of external stakeholders, experts, other people in the city to be able to take some of these action forwards. And then another thing which has happened is that, how do you unlock private capital? Bangalore is a hub of a lot of the MNCs. They all have CSRs. They want to do something in their backyard. And so how do you bring CSR funds to come to bear to some of the climate action that is needed in the city? Otherwise, CSR activities are happening. And again, even small things like planting are devoid of the kind of scientific knowledge that is needed. And so the idea was to bring a CSR cell about to help some of this. And then, other things like mapathons have happened. But this is now the collaborative model for the stewardship of the climate action plan, which has emerged in the city, which is very unique because it brings in knowledge partners, collaborators, friends of Climate Action Cell. They are leading campaigns. Stakeholder departments have been involved through technical committees and steering committees. So that is Bangalore. Coming to Nashik. Nashik, again, city context, again, it's kind of this surrounded by 9 hills. It's really known for its historical, social, cultural significance. The municipal corporation has an area of about 267 square kilometers and a 2.15 million population as of 2021. And again, Nashik also, like many other cities, has seen about 57% increase in population growth from 1981. This is the kind of urbanization which has happened in about a 20-kilometer radius from Nashik. So there has been a good amount of built up, which again has come up in sort of the peripheral areas of Nashik, which tells you about the form of development. In terms of the GHG inventory, this is the profile. So basically for Nashik, it was 2.62 million tons. So again, Bangalore 18, Mumbai 23, Nashik 2.6, just to give you an account of how this variation existed across these plans. The 3 most important sectors in terms of vulnerability and hazard management that were identified were urban heat, urban flooding, water scarcity because of, again, rain variability and erratic precipitation, and air pollution, also because Nashik exists in this industrial belt of Maharashtra. So multi-hazard analysis, just to show you, the amount of population, some of the work that we did to say what is the population which is exposed to heat, which is exposed to waterlogging when that happens, and the ones which are exposed to both. And that talks about, which are the most vulnerable areas in the city, which were the central areas, and that need to be attended to. Similarly, air pollution, just to give you a glimpse of, what we talked about, is that it has been breaching annual limits more and more every year. And we need to kind of tackle that. And so some of these apportionment studies were done to understand that, a lot of the pollution is really coming from industries and road dust, and that is what needs to be tackled on priority. So the governance structure, Nashik Municipal Corporation, the way it panned out is that, within the corporation, the municipal commissioner, one of them, the additional commissioners, has been handed the responsibility and, of the environment department. It is headed by a DMCA, Deputy Municipal Commissioner, Environments. And within that, the climate cell is envisioned to kind of sit. This will consist of environmental experts, data analysts, senior project officers who will kind of be in charge of coordinating across departments to spearhead certain projects and plans. Again, data inputs and tools to give you a sense of, the agencies that were involved. The quality of data had to be, received was quite, it was a bit dodgy. It had to be restructured in GIS or user-friendly formats. So a good bit had to be done in Nashik to kind of make the data usable. The limitations in this mid sort of tier city was that technical and scientific capacities within the departments were quite limited. So there was a lot of hand-holding required to even draw insights from the analysis that we were doing with these officials. And again, in terms of innovation, spatio-temporal data gaps had to be dealt with and filled. Proxies had to be used in many cases. Over here, one difference was that instead of the pathways tool, we use the curb tool. The curb tool, again, developed by World Bank and others. It doesn't require the sort of very detailed and granular input that the pathways tool really takes in. And so the curb tool was used in this context, just given sort of some of the data limitations. So these were, again, the key sectors and the recommendations made, as you can see, again, aligning with sort of departmental priorities. This was the suggestion on the climate action cell that would need to be constituted within the city to say that, environment, climate action cell, gardens department, the Godavari conservation cell. So right now, the way it is sitting is that there's the climate action cell and there's the Godavari conservation cell, Godavari being a major sort of ecological asset within the city and also contributing to flooding and other risks. So these are some of the key initiatives that have been taken up. Climate action cell staffing, Godavari river management, groundwater recharge, EV adoption, solarization of buildings, wastewater recycling and improvement of traffic junctions. So these are the things that have been taken on priority in the city. And also what's happened is that because the Kumbh will be happening in the city in 2027, the city is prioritizing these 4 kinds of things in the city to kind of lay the groundwork for having, a good situation by the time Kumbh arrives. So one is looking at a blue-green strategy, both to address heat, to address air quality, to address, the flooding and other issues in the city. They're looking at the rejuvenation of secondary rivers. So besides Godavari, there are other sort of sub. So the thing that happened after Nashik was that also once Chhatrapati, Sambhaji Nagar and Solapur climate action plans were also done, the government of Maharashtra passed a government regulation and a resolution. And then basically what that said is that climate action cells are mandated at the city, district and divisional levels. And so basically what we have done is we are now supporting the 43 Amrut cities in Maharashtra with building their capacity to develop climate action plans. And so once these cells get instituted, they're able to take action right away. And this is also important because 75% of the state's population resides in these 43 cities. Lastly, coming to Patan, Gujarat. Patan is a very different context. Over here, the primary industry is really agriculture, forest, fishery, as you can see, in stark contrast to the other places. Patan was also the capital of Gujarat in, the 12th century and is historically, known as a hub for architects as it kind of integrates water management, water sensitivity, and heat adaptation in its planning through these valves and these wells. But in terms of its size and scope, it's a really small city. It's 45 square kilometers, has barely a population of 1.3 lakhs, which, and that's recent. But if you look at the 2011 census, it was in a couple of tens of thousands. But it is also experiencing, some amount of growth and has a nominal share of migration through tourism, healthcare, education sector, and so on and so forth. So this is sort of the urbanization trend for Patan as well. As you can see, again, away from the center, moving towards sort of the transport corridors. It is kind of developing in the outskirts. It's developing towards the outskirts of the city. It is still well contained right now, but there's an good amount of increase in built up. From the GHG inventory standpoint, again, stark contrast. Nashik was 2.3 million. This is 0.18 million ton CO2 equivalent. And again, stationary energy being the largest share of the emitters, and then followed by transportation and waste, which are actually very close together. The challenges that we've identified in Patan are in some ways quite different from what we had in other cities. I mean, there is the urban expansion, and there's there's heat and water scarcity and all of that. But there's also issues of, poor surface temperature monitoring. There are no monitors in the city, for example. There's poor water quality. Urban flooding, waterlogging are common issues. Indoor air pollution because of the burning of fuel wood and firewood is very common. There's absence of organized drainage network, and only 13 kilometers is present in a city of that size. And the landfill is in a dire condition. Of course, it has no public transport systems, so it's largely sort of your own motor vehicles and a high number of diesel vehicles in this case. And then the fuel woods that are being used, typically dung cakes, firewood and all of that is creating a lot of problem in terms of air quality. The other thing in terms of and this is just to show you that the city is facing significant sort of climate issues, both on the mitigation and the adaptation side. The mitigation side is not that visible, but if not managed properly, it is going to come to a head. But to also say that there are differential heat risks that we notice, or heat stress that we notice even in a city like Patan, where slum community and their neighborhood areas, which are just 100 or 200 meters away, experience noticeable differences in temperature. Water stress, basically in Patan, the GW situates it at environmentally alarming levels, and the whole district is at an extremely high water stress risk. This is the Nagarpalika structure of Patan. So they have all of these, but in terms of functionality, the main functions that they're doing is sort of laying things, so basically implementation, construction, and providing NOCs and permits in the city. So what that means is that when it comes to climate action planning, things are quite fragmented. Data sources for Patan, as you can see, again, an extensive sources of data that we've been trying to work with. The quality of the data received so far, it's hard to tell because a lot of the data sets have had to be created by our team because those data sets were either missing, not there, or just like generally in poor quality. The limitations are that since most of the functions are not part of the municipal governance and are state-led, the data governance is going to be challenging to kind of unravel. So there's, data that you need from the district, but the district has not been co-opted into the climate action plan process, and so there are these tensions which exist. And then the innovations is that, in some cases we are having to just downscale data from state and regional models when we don't have those data sets available. In terms of sectoral recommendation, the one important thing that had to happen here was one is the focus on inclusivity and co-benefits had to be put forward, just given the socioeconomic status of the people in Patan. And the other one was agriculture, because the agriculture, like in other cities where it lies on the peripheries, agriculture is actually a primary economy. It permeates the city boundaries and is a big part of the city. And so recommendations, with respect to agriculture will have to be provided for Patan. This is just to say that, looking at a different lens of inclusivity, people first approach in climate action planning in Patan city is going to be extremely important, again, given the socio-economic status. This just to say how it's kind of fragmented to the point that I mentioned earlier, that the Nagarpalika is there, but it has very sort of streamlined function, fire, no NOCs, things of that nature. The district office holds a lot of, not just the data, but in terms of the authority, the district and the state office, state level agencies hold a lot of sway. Also because in Gujarat, a large part of the ways things are done are through parastatal agencies and not through sort of necessarily decentralization at the city or Nagarpalika level. So these are the kind of, challenges and gaps that you're dealing with. And so, you have situations on the data side where you have absence of temperature monitoring within Patan, despite of it being one of the most vulnerable to urban heat, down to data analysis of water supply, which has not been done, air quality stations, which are very few, and then reconciling scope 1, 2, 3 challenges because some of these plants that exist are right outside of the municipal boundary, thermal power plants, but of course they must be affecting what's happening downstream, but then that is not taken into account through the tools that we have. And then also, the ownership of the CAP document itself is something that needs to be worked out. And the limited technical and human resource capacity available within the city also makes it very difficult to bring insights and the data sort of validation that we need. So finally, coming to the learnings and what all of this has led us to bring this down to, right? So one is, if I talk about similarities, one is that all of these cases have been top down. So in Mumbai, there was clear political backing. In Bengaluru, there was a C40 mandate. In Nashik, it was steered by the state. In Patan, it has been consultant donor-led. So that's been kind of common. It's been a top-down approach. Second is data and tool centricity. It has been a very heavy data-heavy exercise, the entire exercise of climate action planning. And the question is, do you need that granularity, that sort of specificity of data to tell you what is wrong? I mean, we know instinctively sometimes what is wrong, but, do you need that level of granularity for each exercise? It's debatable, but the data sets and the tools used were similar. The tools were found to have limitations due to context. And data usability was a significant challenge in some cases because data did not exist, and in others because global benchmarks were not mindful of the local context and in the tools that we were using. So this did lead to a high degree of innovation, and the data capacity, sorted cities into, I would say, data rich, data building, or data borrowing groups. The third was leadership changes. All of these cities underwent political or bureaucratic leadership changes, leading to delays, but public pressure was important and basically helped keep things on track. Shared knowledge, CAPS basically became a space to build shared understanding between departments around data and practice. It helped sort of set realistic targets and push for negotiations on long-term systems and system changes that were needed. So in that way, it brought many actors together for the first time. It was a means to confront and acknowledge weaknesses. So CAPS exposed where institutions were weak or fragmented. They pushed cities to ask, hard questions about coordination, about equity, about leadership, and how that would be managed. The one thing, again, in common, like I mentioned earlier, was that they all lacked statutory backing, so they are strategic plans at best, and hence for success, ownership will have to be cultivated among a divergent range of stakeholder groups and through partnering with local actors. On the differences, basically, these are the ones. One is the governance operating structures, powers vested within municipal authority, for example, in the case of Mumbai, versus those that were those where authority was fragmented between levels, for example, Patan, and those which were parastatal operated. Bengaluru formerly had different motivations and interests, and those had to be reconciled. The access to agencies and decision makers differed. So, higher and more involved sort of in small cities context, as you can imagine, in terms of involvement and access to agencies, and the access was more difficult in larger metropolitan areas. Planning legacies and ranks played a huge role, determining sort of the success of the plan and its uptake. In the case of Mumbai, there is a planning hierarchy within established systems. In Bengaluru, it is fragmented and fractured. In Nashik, it is emerging with as good intent, and in Patan, it's non-existent. So all of these, and the fact that, the Patan municipality, Nagarpalika, is led not by an IAS officer, it's just led by a chief officer. These kind of things have played into the differences as well. The primary motivation and buy-in, so cities with political buy-in, Mumbai, Nashik, versus those with bureaucratic buy-in, which is Bangalore, versus citizen buy-in, which is Patan, will achieve differing outcomes. The capacity spectrum also differed. Technical, scientific capacities within agencies differed. Small cities, limited capacities, much more hand-holding needed, but can impact sustainability of the plan and the outcomes on actions. And this is a very important point for them to consider. Data, again, in terms of risk quality, availability, ownership, and access, there were huge amounts of differences. Non-alignment on net zero horizons, it was a function of political priority. Mumbai, straight off the bat, Nashik, they all committed to 2050. They said, we will meet those goals. Bangalore, on the other hand, basically, once India announced 2070 as the horizon year, they said, we're aligning with that. So we're going to make a best attempt to get to 2050 net zero, but then, 2070 is really what we're going to hold the line at. Also, the incentives, cities and city champions had different incentives for supporting CAP. In some cases, it was visibility on global and national platforms. In some cases, it was about status, image building. BBMP has a very bad image with the civic society and citizens, and for them, it was an image building exercise. Access to finance became an important incentive for many of these. And then finally, the citizen and civil society engagement. There were variations depending on presence and history on engagement by civil society on planning processes. So the lessons for policymakers is like this, right? So just, this was something that I was tinkering with, is that if you plot the intent of the city for when we started the CAPS versus the influence and the power that the city wields, Mumbai was at the top of that axis, right? So it had huge intent, political backing, it had huge influence. BMC could do it. Bengaluru was somewhere in the middle. The intent was actually quite weak in the beginning. The influence was quite high when it came to BBMP, and it was there. Nashik, both in terms of intent and influence, was sort of in the middle. The intent was there. I mean, again, this was being pushed by the state, but then also, there was a certain amount of influence that they had as a mid-tiered city. Patan, extreme bottom, very little intent and very little influence that the city has because of its governance structures. The green circles that you see, those spaces are where it has moved since adoption. So if we look at it now, Mumbai, because of sort of leadership changes, the intent has kind of it's sliding backwards a little, so things are happening a bit more slowly. Bengaluru, once the plan was developed, it started going full on out when they realized that this could be a way of, capturing image building and things of that nature with, and increasing the mileage and currency with citizens. So Bengaluru has kind of moved forward. Nashik again has moved forward, partly to kind of look at, the Kumbh imperatives also, which have influenced this. So this is where they lie, right? So I think the lessons are like this, that one is policymakers really need to adopt a tiered, support approach. City typologies of different kinds demand differentiated strategies. So megacities like Mumbai, like they benefit from these strong mandates and capacity, data ecosystems. Smaller cities like Nashik or Patan work within these resource constraints and have to kind of evolve localized systems. The second is, you have to reject the one-size-fits-all template. Caps must be tailored to reflect the realities of city scale, governance structures, and local capabilities. The third, is equip smaller cities with decentralized tools. So how can we encourage sort of modular, adaptable models that build on local knowledge and enable cities to own their, planning processes better? The fourth is prioritize capacity building over substitution. So long-term success hinges really on strengthening institutional and technical capacities. While we have worked on these gaps, we are going to be out of most of these ecosystems. And the idea is that, you don't need to look at replacing, a WRI or any other organization or bypassing or whatever, but you need to be able to create those capacities in-house.
Sorry to interrupt, Jaya,
Yes.
but you might want to close
Yes, just
soon
one
enough.
one
Sure.
moment. Yes, closing it now. Second is engaging with political economy, recognizing city-specific drivers, stakeholders, political champions who influence momentum and legitimacy of climate planning, and engaging with them. Enhancing data platforms for grounded decision-making to strengthen transparency and accountability through localized sort of ecosystems. Revisit state center funding incentives also to ensure that they are reflecting service access realities and not just infrastructure provision. Just because cities want to access, certain funds, they, position themselves in a certain way. Is that the right thing? And then align funding mechanism with city needs. Leverage diverse resources. We have 15th Finance Commission and all of these other places. Nashik, for example, can leverage Amrut, but Patan can only leverage Swachh Bharat. So just the last bit on opportunities for innovations. One is, align CAP goals with political agendas. So figure out synergies between the climate objectives, local political priorities, and how can you kind of bind that together? Create common shared open data platforms. We talked about that quite a bit. How do you create sort of interoperable, transparent data ecosystems to enable evidence planning beyond sort of this initial CAP exercise that has happened? Institutionalize CAPs through statutory integration. How do you bring them within sort of master planning processes to ensure sort of continuity and enforceability? And looking at co-creation of tools with cities, because some of these global level tools don't work in our context. How can that be changed to foster ownership, usability, and relevance? And then also looking at unlocking finance for MSMEs and innovators and startups in this space. That would be an important innovation. Then the fostering cross learning across sort of city tiers, because some cities are going to have really low capacities, some have much higher. How do you disseminate successful models, bridge capacity gaps, and democratize innovation in climate planning? And then finally, building long-term sort of institutional memory and legitimacy. So establishing systems for documenting these CAP processes, decision outcomes. So this ensures continuity beyond the political cycles and strengthens the credibility and the institutionalization of CAPs over time. So that's been our findings, and I've just gone on forever. I realized, Champaka, sorry, I did breach all my time limits, but yeah, that's it. Thank you very much, and happy to take questions now.
Thank you very much, Jaya. Very rich work and so much rigor there. I do recall being part of many of the initial discussions on climate action plans that you were preparing for Mumbai as well as for Bangalore, particularly in Bangalore, where you even discussed with many experts as well as civil society representatives of civil society organizations on the kinds of methodologies that you must devise to make sure that you've actually, you're very comprehensive in terms of addressing multiple facets of concerns that cities you're dealing with face. So this was really wonderful to see. And there are many compliments that several attendees have shared. Before we go ahead with questions from participants, I had one overarching sort of a question. In climate action planning, you mentioned, for example, at the normative levels, you have several regulatory, institutional mechanisms, etc., that you've proposed, and you've also recommended that these need to be fleshed out in terms of implementation models. And at the operative levels, there's possibilities to take these on through nature-based solutions, for instance, and a whole range of other instruments as well. Were there any discussions on fundamental, like structural value chain shifts across markets? For example, if we're looking at the construction industry, or we're looking at the pharmaceuticals industries, which the kinds of effluents that are discharged lead to antimicrobial resistance, for instance, and these are all serious problems that we're facing. So were there any discussions that you had with administrators or with political agents about the need to think about value chain shifts? And then we'll open up questions for all the participants.
Yeah, no, thanks, Champaka. So basically on the value chain shift, so the one thing was that, when these baselines were being developed and the recommendations and even the targets were being developed, a lot of who was consulted was city agencies, heads of different departments and agencies who were assumed to be kind of, knowing and well versed with the situation to understand how much they can push the envelope. So they were sort of proxies and representatives of, the market influencers and those agents and their mechanisms and what needed to be changed. And so while the recommendations were made in great detail about, all the things and all the places where these shifts need to happen, I think the difference is that the spokespeople for this was really the departmental agencies and various heads of departments, engineers who had worked in these departments, who were the sort of interlocutors with the market systems, but were speaking on behalf of those markets. But then, of course, there was expert consultations as well, and discussions on how some of these value chains can be changed up.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'll pass the discussion over to Rama, my colleague who's at our office at New Delhi. Rama, would there be questions from in-person participants?
Thank you, Jaya, for this talk. As of now, Champaka, we don't have questions in the room. So maybe we can move to chat box, or we can ask participants to ask their question.
That sounds great. Thank you. There are two hands that have gone up. There's one from Mr. Bhavani B and Mr. Yogendra Sharma. I will unmute you. If you could please raise your question, Mr. Yogendra Sharma. Over to you, Mr. Yogendra Sharma. Did you have a question or a thought to share?
Good evening to all of you. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, thank you so much. And at the outset, I would say Jaya had made a brilliant presentation. Congratulations.
Did you have a question to share?
Yes, good. Because this is actually a bit confusing screening that comes. Anyway, my question is coming to climate objectivity and then political priorities. If you see Mumbai and 42% population that belongs to slums, where do you see actually this population as a climate resilient city in terms of your climate next climate action plans? So if you could briefly outline that, okay, how and when we are going to phase wise see this population and where it would be in Mumbai, in climate resilient Mumbai.
Should I go ahead, Champaka?
So should I repeat it again, Jaya?
No, I got you, Mr. Sharma. Thank you for the question, and thank you very much.
Because the screen is actually blinking, so it's creating more confusion. Thank you, please.
Okay, so basically, One is that, on the when it comes to sort of these vulnerable populations, whether it's informal settlements, whether it's migrant workers. In the case of Mumbai, of course, the whole point is that, in terms of resilience, the one thing that we all have recognized, and partly also due to COVID, right? We are pretty much, the chain is as strong as its weakest link. So unless we make the most vulnerable population, resilient, climate resilient, this is not going to work out in our favor. So the whole point of why we developed the climate hazards vulnerability assessment was exactly this, right? Because the point being that, when Mumbai gets flooded, and the way Amitabh Bachchan experiences it in his home, and when that makes news, and the way sort of the communities right outside his home experience it is very different. And the whole point is about, how do you make not just the underserved, but like these kind of vulnerable populations, how do you identify them, and then how do you create mechanisms and measures by which those communities can be made more resilient. So I would say that, in Mumbai, also in Bangalore, I think a large part of the focus through the CHVA framework is on exactly this, to recognize differential vulnerabilities and then suggest mechanisms and ways through which these communities can be made more resilient.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jaya. There are a spectrum of questions, some that are technical in nature, others that are pertaining to capacity, and I'll try and cluster some of these. Mr. Dibyendu Mukhopadhyay has questions from a technological perspective. He says, here, digital twin technology is used by many startups in Mumbai to model and assess heat stress, which can interpolate and extrapolate to find hazard-affected people and area. Could it be used for addressing sustainability? That's one question, which is about digital twin technology. The other he has is about innovation in technology, which he says has reached a pinnacle. What could be your suggestion on adoption of innovative climate-friendly technology as per the Place Society organization based on Rogers diffusion of innovation? Over to you, Jaya.
Sure. So on the first question of the digital twin, I think a lot of cities are considering this, contemplating this. I know that in Bangalore itself, because it's sort of, Silicon Valley, India, and, tech capital, there's this consideration that if we create a digital twin, we will be able to, with better forecast, we'll be able to tell what the impacts of certain problems might be. To a certain extent, digital twins, it's an interesting concept. This is my position on it. It's an interesting concept, but I think some of the realities will still have to be very grounded, because you can create digital twins and you can create these models, but unless they reflect grounded realities, for example, a drain may be present, right, in a certain situation, but if it is not flowing to its full capacity, or it is compromised, or it has certain other issues with it, or there are sort of localized challenges, a tree has fallen or something, so these kind of realities would be hard to capture through a digital twin model. Largely, it can tell you at a very surface level of, sure, these are the areas which are probably precarious and you need to pay more attention to them. But unless it is supported by sort of grounded realities, it is going to have very limited effectiveness. So that's on the digital twin. I think those kind of concepts work in cities, and places like Singapore have adopted it. But because, they have very different sort of levels of progress, very different systems in place, very different levels of monitoring that goes on in those kind of cities. And over there, it works pretty well. And, in that context, it is probably suitable. On the question of innovation, I think absolutely. Innovation has to come in, and not just tech innovation. Innovation has to come in all forms. So, what we did as part of some of our work on climate action, as, subsequent to that, was we created an accelerator for all the people that were innovating on waste, when energy, water, those kind of things, air quality. And we said, MSMEs, innovators, startups who have any kind of suggestions on how to kind of create and make these situations better, please come to us. And we did pilot some of these innovations. The challenge with innovations currently is that governments are kind of very reluctant to take them on unless you de-risk them, right? So if you go to a government procurement department and you tell them that, I have an innovation, they will look at their procurement sheets to say, well, but does it match the criteria that I have laid this out. A lot of the times their criteria are basically the lowest cost, and it doesn't go by sort of, the impact of the innovation or the outcome-based sort of criteria. So, but innovations are absolutely needed. And in India itself, I think the ecosystem has matured quite a lot when it comes to climate innovators. And I think in the MSME sectors only, I think a number that I was hearing was that in 2021, we have about 3.1 billion USD worth of, innovations which are kind of happening in just India, and that ecosystem has expanded. So absolutely, we need more of those coming in, and we also need people to be working with city governments to streamline the procurement processes on the other end.
That's a very important insight. In fact, de-risking innovation. Indeed, the digital twin model is a very centralized sort of a model for data management, and that's been my experience as well. So I fully align with you on your perspective that it doesn't capture granular data at the local levels. Although I also see your earlier point that it's important to not be obsessed with data accuracy where you don't really need it. There's a fine line that one has to draw, I suppose, to make sure that it doesn't become a very expensive affair due to data intensivity. Also, innovation scholars have actually argued that innovations are ubiquitously made possible only if they are driven by democratically led mediated processes. And your process, of course, has been very participatory. So I believe there's a good synergy there. There are
Champaka, just to add that, one is that you want to make sure that two things that you want to make sure. One is that the innovation is really benefiting the bottom of the pyramid, right? So that is what you want to catch and see how it can be leveraged for public good, not just for private good or in the hands of a few who have the resources. And the second point on that is that basically you need to also align some of the policies and procedures to kind of make that happen, to sort of put out sharper understanding in the ecosystem of the problem itself, so that innovators are able to respond better.
Absolutely. We have a couple of questions from Dr. Partha Mukhopadhyay. He says, in Bengaluru, it looks like a nice consultative framework, but what is the action quotient vis-a-vis Mumbai? What can we learn from how the 1 crore per ward was spent? Is there local customization? What is the story on lake rejuvenation? Would you like to respond to that? And then there's another question he has about, how he says his question is, was the Environment and Climate Change Department at BMC, the Mumbai Municipal Corporation, staffed by reallocating people from other departments or by new hires? So that's a capacity question, and the earlier one from him is pertaining to allocation of resources at the local levels.
Right. Thank you, Partha. Great set of questions. I think on the first one, in terms of what has actually panned out, in Bangalore vis-a-vis Mumbai, although the framework is great and sort of it seems very participatory, I think what has panned out is actually in many ways, in the initial set of climate action planning, Bangalore was learning from Mumbai's experience. And I think now we have put in place a sort of virtuous cycle, or something that we'd like to believe is a virtuous cycle within the city government, where now Mumbai and other cities are looking at Bangalore and what it's doing. And a big reason for that is the alignment with the person who was in charge of the gardens department, and kind of creating that mechanism, whereas the environment department, now it has become a more cohesive and a whole department, and now it is climate action cell has been placed under that person. So the person has a lot of authority. The IAS officer in charge has a lot of authority to kind of take forward a lot of the Blue Green initiatives, which is kind of the front runner in the city and what is happening right now. The other thing, like I said, that happened was because of the Greater Bengaluru Authority being established, the Climate Action Cell has actually now become part of that bill. It is part of the act. And so the thing is that the Climate Action Cell, unless something else happens, stays in perpetuity. And so, there will be funds allocated for it to kind of take forward its action. I think the one good thing that has emanated from, the Greater Bengaluru Governance Bill is definitely this. and therefore there's allocations being made and there are actions being taken towards the blue-green situation in the city. As far as the ward level action plans are concerned, so 1 crore, so that has been just kind of recently allocated. So these wards are still working towards what they want. There was a temptation to kind of jump in and say that here is a model or here is a template that you should follow and look at to kind of develop these ward level action plans and roadmaps. But we kind of all held back on that temptation, the city included, to say, let that evolve, let that be a participatory process, let that come from ground up. And so for all of these wards, the actions that are being proposed, 1 crore, by the way, isn't a lot, right? So the actions that are being proposed, in some cases, wards are prioritizing solarization. In some cases, they're prioritizing drinking water. So the things which are coming out of this are very different, and we are allowing, in the sense the ecosystem is allowing that to happen, the city is allowing that to happen. There are 28 wards now which have this allocation. The idea is, to see how these pan out, and also can this seed funding then be leveraged to get more funding within those wards for additional climate action? And then what can these sort of pilot wards inform at the city level, so that the rest of the 180 wards learn from the exercises which are being done now? So I think right now the city is holding back in terms of templatizing anything, but I think we are letting each of these wards do their own sort of small exercises. In terms of, and I think your last question was about the allocation, the reallocation. Sorry, the last
The
question.
allocation of staff,
Oh yeah,
were
the
they
allocation of staff.
reallocated across departments or they were new hires?
So both. It was a combination of both. In fact, a lot of them are reallocations, but a significant amount of them, there were job descriptions that were put out. In fact, even for the fellows that were brought in, JDs were put out. And then you realize how much, no matter what happens, how much in demand these government jobs really are. And you get hordes of applications, and then the department is kind of wading through them, making some choices in the face of political economy. Yeah.
There are a range of other questions as well. There's one on coastal action plan. What is the coastal action plan to mitigate climate change in Mumbai? Would you like to respond to that, Jaya?
Yeah, just to say that, there are two things on Mumbai. Is that, so, there's all this, doomsday sort of predictions about sea level rise and Mumbai is going to drown and all that's going to happen. So I think part of the work that we did was, one, to kind of put this to rest, right? That sure, at some level in the future and under severe climate conditions that may happen, but that's not really the risk that you're dealing with presently. The risk that you're dealing with is coastal, the coastal line changes, the accretion that is happening, the coastal line changes which are happening, the ecological systems change which result in that, the things that it impacts, things like, mangroves, right, which are natural resilience mechanisms for the coast. What is the health of those mangroves? Looking at the health of the mangroves, saying that, are they in a good enough state to kind of create that resilience and create the buffers that we need? Are there spaces where, these are eroding? What are the actions, therefore, that are needed? Because also these mangroves exist in sort of precarious conditions in very close proximity of informal settlements. And then it becomes a whole contentious issue of, do you protect the environment? Do you protect, in vulnerable communities and informal settlements? So it's a very interesting, but it's a very challenging dynamic that we're facing over there. And I think the other thing was that, with respect to the CRZs, the zones, right? And when you mark those out, I think because of this changing coastline, one of the questions was that, how do you ensure that then the CRZs are responding to that, changing coastline and are getting sort of reoriented so that, areas that need to be put out or brought in, that you're able to do that. So a lot of it is around the ecologies and the economies that are in the coastal areas, and how to build the resilience for that.
Sure. More questions. There's one from Kanishka Kakar who says, how many cities across India have climate action plans and how many action plans that is not specific to climate environment? How many cities across have climate action plans is a more tangible question, of course. Would you have a sense of that?
Yeah, so what's happening is, and then the question is define climate action plans, right? Because I think a lot of cities claim to have climate action plans. In fact, when we started in Bengaluru, there was a claim that Bengaluru also has a climate action plan, right? So the question is, are we talking about global standards, the one that adhere to sort of GPCs in terms of doing the baselines and then have followed a certain framework, a certain robust framework for doing vulnerability assessments? In that case, it is just a handful of cities, less than a dozen. But if you're talking about, places where a lot of the, and not to denigrate consultants or anybody else, but just to say that, where people are going in and creating some kind of response action or what they are calling climate action plans. There are many cities in India, and we won't even know, how many, but there are probably many cities in India who are doing this. The one thing that I do want to mention is that what is at risk because of these proliferations of climate action plans happening helter-skelter is that, we've noticed that, I showed you the GHG baseline emissions profile for all of these 4 cities, and you noticed how there's gradual sort of, drops when it comes to city size, population, economic activity, and all of that. But we did notice, and it came to our attention, for example, that a small city, a very small city in Madhya Pradesh or UP, I can't remember, had put out an emissions inventory, which was almost the equivalent of Mumbai. And it just seemed, it just did not seem right? So we have this challenge where if we don't get some of these baselines right, if some of these inventories right, we have the challenge of, cities running amok with climate action plans, with consultants or with people who are not using scientific methods, proven methods, and you come up with a host of climate action plans which are so devoid of reality that then, any kind of targets that you set and any of that will eventually not work out and will not eventually pan out. So there is a bit of that danger and risk. Although I said that some of these tools are very onerous, they are very detail-oriented, very sort of data-specific, and we don't need that level of specificity necessarily, but at the same time, I think the other extreme is true as well.
Absolutely. Thanks for elaborating on that question from sort of more, structural perspectives about the legitimacy and the importance of climate action plans and action plans per se. The second part of that question is also an important one, Kanishka Kakkar's question, she asks, how many cities have action plans that is not specific to climate or the environment? And that's a question that urban planners have been struggling with for ever so many years, right? There are no cities really with action plans as such. But would you want to take that question?
Yes, so Kanishka, I think it's 2 things, right? I mean, one is that there are, development plans, master plans, and Champaka, you should come in and answer this as well, and how much they are responding to the realities of climate action in cities. But cities are also going ahead with other kinds of action plans like heat action plans, or things which are specific to their location, like water resilience, things of that nature. So there are those kind of plans which are kind of coming in as a response to the doorstep problem that we have right now, which is heat, which is localized flooding, waterlogging, water scarcity issues, and there are plans which are responding to that context. But master plans and development plans, are they responding yet? Not really, but for example, the revised Delhi master plan, the iteration which has again not gotten approved, right? They made mention of a blue-green infrastructure policy that is needed for the city of Delhi. Now, where that blue-green infrastructure policy sits, to what extent does it embed climate imperatives? I'm not sure, but I think I know that for Bangalore, it doesn't. So literally the master plan is sitting in one place, the climate action plan is a different one. Right now, the master plan in Bangalore is a whole different story because there have been 5 different iterations, none of which have gotten adopted. But the point is that they're not speaking to each other at the moment, and that's the situation.
Yes, and this has been a long-drawn struggle, of course, in among the planning fraternity to sort of institutionalize a planning process that occurs at multiple scales, at the macro level of the master plan, which is the statutory plan, and this statutory plan would integrate a whole range of other strategic plans for the city, which are now increasingly becoming more prevalent. And the effective implementation of these strategic orientations and the statutory master plan itself should ideally be followed up by a local area plan, which is initiated at the ward level. There's political accountability there because there's elected representatives, which then become custodians of these local area plans. But that whole process is, it's related to the devolution of power. So it's a struggle which we will hopefully see lessen as we make as we see more innovations in planning practice. I'd hope.
Yeah, Champaka, just one more point on that to say that, the fact that the climate budget for Bangalore, other places, that, for example, becomes a very interesting proxy mechanism because essentially all the departments are part of the climate budgeting exercise. So they're aware of what they need to do. So the development authority is aware of what they need to do, what they need to embed in the master planning process. Whether they do it or not, of course, is a separate matter, but at least there is awareness and there is a system of, asking the questions to say that, you have been very much a part of this. And so what are you showing as part of, being integrated in the system?
And the Delhi master plan, more recently, the draft plan 2041, has has an entire framework which goes beyond just land use and transport. For instance, it incorporates all infrastructure sectors, heritage, environmental protection, emissions, climate action. All of these strategic imperatives are part of the draft plan that is currently with the government. And they also have a very elaborate action plan framework. So hopefully these are all the practice innovations in the planning sphere, which we must take cognizance of, even though the legislation actually does not specify action plans. But there are many process innovations on the ground, I believe, which we must appreciate. Moving forward, there are a couple of questions on Nashik. Partho, again, I believe he has had to leave the leave this workshop, but it's an important question I think we must think about. He says, despite the limited capacity in Nashik, it was nice to see the focus on rejuvenation of rivers driven by the preparations for the Kumbh, apparently a very local driver. In this case, the Kumbh is also top of the mind for the state, is also on the top of the mind for the state. So is this rejuvenation locally driven or prioritized by the state? Or both, perhaps, right?
It's both. It's both, really. I think, given the outcomes of this year's Kumbh and all of that, and that being envisioned also as a very important economic driver and economic activity, it is something which is being driven by both the state and the city. But of course, city has clear directives from the state to make sure that this, goes down seamlessly.
There's another related question from an anonymous attendee. He says he's a retired senior citizen at Nashik. He's inquiring whom he could contact in the city to participate in the collective efforts. Would you have thoughts on that? Would you want to share it in the chat?
Yes, I can share it in the chat. I have colleagues. So I have, Mumbai office was supporting some of the efforts in Nashik. I also have colleagues in Nashik, who are stationed there and that he could contact. But I'm happy to share their contacts. It's Mukta and Ved, and Avni, but I'll just share their contacts.
Sure, thank you. Many questions. Ritika Ramasuri has a question. She says, could you share the definitions you had for data rich, data borrowing, data building?
Yeah, so I think that was, again, that was the whole idea of places which have the data, have the ability to share it, have quality data, which is standardized. So, those are sort of the data rich. So the data rich wasn't just about the quantity of the data, it was about the quality, it was about access, it was about all of those enablers. The data borrowing, I think in that sense, was, the cities which, for example, are looking at national data sets, state level data sets and then downscaling happening in Patan quite a bit. District level data, state level data, national level data is being downscaled because, you know, these places don't have it. And data building, really cities like Nashik, I would say, you know, like, again, it's a classic sort of big city, medium city, small city context. And, you know, Nashik has the right intent, is moving in the right direction, but they're also looking at building sort of standardized data sets, which can then be used for the further iterations of not just the climate action plan, but all kinds of, you know, activities that they'll take on in the city.
Moving forward, Mr. Dibyendu Mukhopadhyay has another question. He says, based on slides 75 to 80, what are the works that local people can do which are crucial and affordable for them to realize local participation in climate protection to achieve sustainability?
I'm just looking at slide 75 to 80 here. Okay, so this is about Patan. Right. And the question is, what can local people do?
Yes,
Yeah.
what can local people do? That's right. For better, to do, what can local people do as efforts which are crucial and affordable for them?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, you know, the good thing about places like Patan, despite of, you know, the data situation, the fragmented sort of governance situation, is that there is very high degree of ownership, right? In Bangalore, because a lot of the people are sort of, you know, they've come in from outside and all of that, the degree of ownership in certain cases, you know, is not there, while there's a very high civic society sort of involvement in processes. But in Patan and small places, even in Nashik, you know, there's a very high degree of ownership. And that's what we need to leverage and see how this can be aligned to political agendas. And those political agendas could be health, economic development, you know, education, any of that. And how can we align those better? You know, certain things that we spoke about, like indoor air pollution from just burning firewood, dung cakes, and all of that. It's a major issue in a place like Patan that no one's paying attention to. And you know, what can be done to incentivize cleaner fuels? And there are sort of perverse incentives for people to use this because it's less expensive than cleaner fuels. You know, so some of these price cost sensitivities, can these be worked upon? And at the state level, can these be incentivized in these smaller places for people to kind of move towards cleaner fuels is one example. The other is, you know, agriculture. Agriculture is a dominant economy over there. You know, and not just from an agriculture standpoint, but from a city standpoint, from the livelihood standpoint, it is going to have a bearing on those people. So how can we make agricultural practices more resilient is something that we have not had to think about in Mumbai or Bangalore, but we will have to think about in the case of Patan, is how do you bring resilience to that economy? And those will be very different ways of doing it.
Those are great thoughts, going beyond just the urban economy and questions around affordability on adaptive solutions here. There's an anonymous attendee who has a question on what your take is on the nature of outcomes that would play out based on primary motivations for buy-in. Any particular stakeholder better for desired outcomes over others? What's your take on the nature of outcomes that would play out based on primary motivations for buy-in?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the context. Again, the motivations, you know, who is the primary sort of driver, and then how these outcomes play out become a function of the context. And we've seen that difference in Mumbai and Bangalore and Nashik and Patan. And again, this is not meant to sort of generalize this, but this has been our observation in these 4 cities. And the way it plays out in the nature of outcomes is, one, like I said, for a case of Patan or a Nashik, the outcomes would be highly sort of co-created. There would be greater ownership for those outcomes and likely sustainability of those outcomes. In the case of a Mumbai or a Bangalore, I think those outcomes would have to, you know, you would have to keep steering them and then embed them in institutional processes to ensure the sustainability. We could not rely, say, on just community action or, you know, community groups taking those things forward. And so that's how those, you know, the level of outcomes and would differ also depending on ownership.
Sure. In relation to that, there are two questions from anonymous attendees. The first one is, what actions were taken to prevent encroachment on floodplains, especially since they often displace the most vulnerable? And the second is on what actions were taken to ensure that any future infrastructural development undertakes prior climate impact assessments?
Yes, so I think both of these, one is, I'll answer your second question first, that, how does future infrastructural development integrate climate imperatives or climate impact assessments? I think that is that is a very strong recommendation that has been made throughout, all of the sectors, that even when you're installing, for example, solar panels, what is the underlying implication that it has, to be aware of unintended negative externalities and consequences. I think a lot of the recommendations speak to that in the climate action plan. And while we don't have, climate impact assessments happening at project level, the whole idea is that for the city agencies and the departments to be cognizant of that, so that when they are developing plans or when plans are coming to them, that they're able to make these, distinctions. If a metro rail is going in and in a certain alignment, trees need to be felled, does that really need to happen? Is there a different way or an alternative mechanism by which we can look at this? What are the pros and cons? And then make basically informed choices. It may still not be the ideal choice, but at least it's an informed choice. So these are the kind of mechanisms which have been built into the CAP to help agencies have these conversations and make this happen. The other one on, sorry, it was about displacement. I think it was around displacement.
That's
and
right.
how to
Floodplains and displacement.
Floodplains and displacement. And that is the whole point, right? Because in the case of Bengaluru, in the case of Mumbai, along the coastal areas, people have built into these, vulnerable spaces, ecologically sensitive spaces. And so it's a very difficult decision between, do you do like an NGT version of clear all the, all the green spaces and just, break everything down, move everybody out. And in a Mumbai context, Mumbai fairly. But I think in the case, not to say that wouldn't lead to loss of livelihoods and other negative externalities, but in the case of, Bangalore, doing that for sort of the floodplains that exist here, or for the Rajakal ways, the drains and the natural buffers, it would be a very difficult thing. So I think the consensus over there was that we need to have targets because the plan speaks to a 2050, 2070 horizon. So we need to have targets, but for every action that is being taken, what is the complementary action that is being put into place? So if we are saying, reinstate blue-green infrastructure in these parts of the city in localized ways, reinstate it, can there be mechanisms by which you can do a pros and cons assessment? Places which are absolutely critical. Some of the drainage systems in Bangalore are absolutely critical, have been built upon. They need to be revitalized. Are there sort of low friction ways of doing it? If not, how can it be done incrementally in a way so that you're not hurting, people's livelihoods and sort of their living spaces? So, these kind of imperatives have also been taken into account and built into the targets that have been established as part of the CAP process.
I also recall, one of the discussions that had come up during the participatory processes you were organizing, along with C40 cities. Generally, what we hear as projects that are announced are in the form of budget reallocations, right? So there will be announcements of an expressway that's getting built and it's going to cost 36,000 crores or whatever the amount is allocated by the government. And one of the recommendations that everyone in these workshops had, and we recurrently made had these discussions about outcomes-driven planning processes and climate action is a perfect situation for predetermining what kinds of outcomes citizens want or inhabitants of cities want from a particular plan. And then how do you devise regulations, other kinds of mechanisms to make sure that incentives are built in across a heterogeneous range of actors who may all be quite misaligned in terms of their values and goals, and how they're going to be actually motivated to accomplish those shared outcomes. So that becomes really important as well as part of climate action. There are questions, very interesting questions still remaining. There's one from Krishanu Malik. The National Productivity Council had carried out a comprehensive sectoral study way back in 2010-11. Read with that, the BEE had assessed in the India energy scenario, Ministry of Power, in the India Energy Scenario 2024 report, that about 24% of electricity is consumed by the residential building sector. How does your CAP integrate the government R&R like ECSBC, which is the ECSBC 2024 and ECBC 2017, which is for the building codes, to reduce this increasing urban consumption? Buildings is, of course, one of the major contributors to emissions.
Yes, and this is an interesting question because, this whole debate between, how do you align behavior change for reduced consumption, and not just for energy, for a lot of these inputs, and in fact, some of the baselines, that we put forward and all, they were asking questions about consumption, whether it's fuel consumption or whatever. So all of that. So in terms of, the BE's sort of, the building energy efficiency and sort of what they are trying to achieve, and then the ECBC codes and all of that was factored into the, the CAP formulation of the energy sector. And then depending on the city, depending on sort of, Karnataka, for example, has has some of the higher, quantities of renewable energy and solar energies and basically power in general in the state. And so all of the recommendations in the CAP for these different CAPs were made basis and taking into account those realities at each of those cities levels, and what kind of targets your local utilities were comfortable setting in a way that would not hamper their grids, and at the same time, would sort of achieve the kind of outcomes in terms of renewable energy and other kinds of energy targets that we were seeking for the state. So ECBC, all of these, were taken into account, and a lot of these actors were involved. The experts from these places were involved in the formulation of the recommendations as well.
And these have also been integral to the climate assessment framework that you've formulated. I recall that it's very much integral to the climate assessment framework. There are several other questions. There are a lot of participants who've congratulated you on this very comprehensive presentation. They've also made a request if the slide deck can be made available to them. Would that be possible, Jaya?
Sure.
For assessments, etc. Oh, that's wonderful. We could tag it with our with the online the session that goes online is on our website, and if you could please share the presentation with us later, or the link to the presentation with us later. Thank you. There are more questions. There's Saleha Sapra. She says, thank you for the comprehensive presentation. I see that the CAPs have a scale differential versus the pilot solutions offered. Since you mentioned these can't be one-size-fits-all interventions, are you also looking at hyper-local climate action plans within each city to mobilize more people participation and to capture nuance? Are you also covering more cities in India?
Yeah, to the first part, I mean, that's the whole point of, scaling down and doing the ward level climate action plans, which is what, the ambition is, that at the city level, a certain baseline has been created, a certain sort of sense of here is the state of play has been created, recommendations have been created at the sectoral level. But where the rubber really meets the road is going to be at the neighborhood or the ward levels, at the sub-city levels. And yes, the idea for the setting up of these climate action cells, one of their functions beyond coordination across departments to, to kind of get some of these recommendations rolling is also the initiation of these and kind of hand-holding communities which are looking at ward level and neighborhood level climate action roadmaps. And so, yes, that is very much, going to be a part of that. And the whole idea is that you have to really look at those nuances at the ground level. The ground level information really has to be fed in at sub-city scale for any of this to be effective. The second part of, are we covering more cities in India? I don't think so. So I think, the idea was to sort of look at some of these frameworks, set some of these templates, the methodologies in place. And I think our work is done. I think Delhi and Mumbai for us are our deep dive cities, as is Nashik. So we have sort of vested interests in seeing how the climate action plans now take off and move across in these cities. But I doubt that we will be doing these for any additional cities, at least as of now, there's no plan to.
Thanks, Jaya. Arushi Gupta has a question. She says, are there opportunities to improve the data availability and quality for Indian cities? Which actors do you think are best placed to absorb the responsibility and associated costs? I have a lot of thoughts on those as well, but over to you.
No, please go ahead, Champak. I would like for you to respond to this.
I've been working on data governance for several years now. And the custodianship of data is one of the most unresolved questions, right? Who is responsible and custodian of all of the data that's being generated at multiple levels of disaggregation? There's governments that generate data sets at national, state, local levels. And there's also all kinds of other actors. There's businesses, there's all of us as individuals that are generating data. So a broader perspective around data is that data has to be seen as public infrastructure, just as land, labor, capital, water resources, etc., are also seen as public infrastructure. Data needs to be seen as public infrastructure, and therefore it has to be the state that regulates data. And to respond also to specific questions, the specific question on which actors do you think are best placed to absorb the responsibility? It's a general position that authorities that are closest to the producers of data need to be custodian of that data. So that's the general principle that's around. But at the municipal level, of course, there needs to be political accountabilities to all of this. So I'll leave it there, but over back to you, Jaya, for your responses.
I think the one thing that I would like to say about that is that, many of these cities, because they were smart cities or whatever, they also had these integrated control and command centers that were placed in these cities, which were gathering a bunch of data. And all they were doing is gathering. They weren't actually doing anything else. They weren't utilizing those data sets to kind of spit out insights or act as feedback loops to help other agencies do their work better. But recently I visited Bengaluru's ICCC, and I was actually blown away by the kind of data and the ways in which they are mapping it, the sort of just the amount of data and the good quality of data that they have. Are they using that data to address certain things? Yes. So the BBMP has been using some of that data to kind of, but do things like this, right? Address flooding hotspots as soon as something happens, because they can see it visually on their monitor about, okay, this precipitation is happening. What are the areas that are going to flood? So they're doing it in reactionary mode, but can they use that better? Can they, house it in a better way and, make it more democratic and usable? The answer is yes. The infrastructure actually exists. So a major part of the capital costs are already kind of taken, have been taken care of. It's basically now operations that they would have to figure out and to create use cases of the data that they're getting as input. So that's one option, but agree with Champaka on, people who are closest to sort of these data sets are the ones who should be housing it.
Yes, these are, wider normatives that are, that are proposed by the UNGGIM, the United Nations Committee of Experts on Global Geospatial Information Management. So for instance, they also have fundamental data sets that they recommend, as opposed to creating extensive and expensive kinds of data sets, right? So it's possible for cities to optimize on their costs by producing just the minimum number of data sets, and we've seen those in many of our plans, Jaya, that we've worked on in the past.
Yeah.
There are other questions. There's one from Deepika Lele. She says, while climate policy can't be a one size fits all approach, carrying out detailed studies might not be feasible for all cities. Do you think a prototyping exercise could help? This could mean grouping by geography, population, tourist, religious attractions. So Nashik's solutions could be slightly tailored and fit to a city like Ujjain. Thoughts from you, Jaya?
No, that's interesting. And this is the thing that we have been wondering about as well, because there are many things involved. You have to take into consideration, geoclimatic zones and so on and so forth. So socioeconomic realities of cities are also often very different. And since we are looking at climate action in India, looking at sort of the adaptation side of things very seriously, very closely now, just because, again, it's at our doorstep. This is something that we need to deal with. Some of these granularities may be lost when you try to, templatize this for regions, although that may seem like that's the most efficient way of doing things. The whole point of, the 43 Amrut cities in Maharashtra and, capacitating them was that, in a way, it was to say that if you do these 43 cities, not only do you tackle 75% of the population living in the state, but then these 43 cities can teach down, some of the other cities on how to kind of create their climate action plans in a much more quicker and more efficient way. So that was the thought behind doing this as well. And so, you take the coastal areas of Maharashtra, the middle portion, the terrain, which is, around the rivers, and you create that. So I think to a certain level, I think the answer is both yes and no, that you can do it to a certain extent, but I think the best thing to do would be really to democratize the tools so that those become available to city authorities, but also to anybody else who's trying to, communities, consultants who are trying to develop these climate action plans in those cities to be able to, develop these on their own. So I would say that might be a better approach than to kind of, templatize the whole thing and do a generic plan. Yeah.
Absolutely. And Tokyo has a lot of great examples of how to democratize climate action plans at a very granular level. Also disaster management, so to say. And it's actually locally driven solutions that inform municipal corporations' efforts in sort of drawing up more relevant plans. Just a couple more questions. There's Jiufei Ren has a question on capacity. Capacity varies across cities. Are the imaginaries of climate futures also varying across places? Can you give some examples? Are imaginaries of climate futures also varying across places?
Yes.
Can you give some examples?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, really, this presentation in a way was, illustrated that exact point, right? That across places, the climate futures will vary. The imaginaries of the climate futures will also be very different. I think the ways in which, for example, a Patan or a Nashik needs to be thinking about their climate future, what they prioritize on the adaptation side, on the mitigation side, is going to be different from the way Bangalore or Mumbai are going to be envisioning their climate futures. It is also going to be very linked to their economies. And, how do you make those economies resilient in addition to making people and infrastructure resilient? So yes, there will be, there are these differences. Cities also, because the whole point of a climate action plan is to take local context and realities into account, to take local voices also into account, right? Like the vision and the ambition that I, as a leader, or as a political leader, or even a bureaucrat in a city like Nashik, may be very different from my vision for what Bangalore could achieve and what climate resilience should look like. And yes, those realities are very much different. And the whole point is that the climate action plan, hopefully captures those kinds of realities and the distinctions between the different types of cities.
Absolutely. And I think your response to the earlier question also would speak to this one, where you sort of democratize the process and mainstream it in a way that everybody owns the process. There was a similar question, not many more questions left, but basically another question by Kanishka Kakar, who was building upon the earlier question. Just to continue the earlier question by me, it seems to me that making a climate action plan is a very sophisticated undertaking, and it's not clear to me how this will scale up across all of India, or even all cities/towns. If action plans already exist, it might provide some existing bureaucratic infrastructure to build on. But we've perhaps already dealt with the question on action plans and scaling up. Would you want to add anything more to what you already had on mind?
Yeah, no, just to say that, yes, do we need such a extremely granular, detailed, exercise? Does it make a difference if we know that, Mumbai's emissions are 23.34x, million tons CO2 equivalent, or is it enough to know that it's in the range of, 20 million or whatever? So do you need that level of sophistication and that level of tooling? No, you don't, right? These were also experiments, I think, for us to see that, what do you arrive at? Is this necessary to be able to answer some of these questions? And is this, easily done if you remove, us and others from the equation? Can a city kind of take it on, and would it be onerous for them? So those are the things that we have also realized, which is why our push is towards ensuring that tools are more contextualized. They're made simpler so that, cities can adopt them and take them on, and doesn't have to be this big, large sort of rocket science type of exercise.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It shouldn't become such a specialized effort that only a couple of people can actually do this in the end, right? Overall, there's been a lot of appreciation for your presentation. There's just one last question on Patan. Ritika Ramsuri again has a question on which are the parastatal agencies in Patan that you were referring to?
So it was in the presentation, but basically, the parastatal agencies, again, it's the state parastatals. Gujarat, works, as you may know, largely Gujarat works with this whole model of parastatals, and that's how, and in mission mode, so that's how they get things done. So yeah, so let me just find that as well. But to answer your question, so basically, public transport agencies are parastatal, the electricity, groundwater, Gujarat State Disaster Management, the MAUD, the Municipal Administration, Urban Development, Industrial Corporation, Forest Environment Department, all of these basically are sort of state level agencies, which need to be involved with and would be instrumental in driving a lot of the climate action work in the state, but also in small cities like Patan. I think the thing with Patan is that, they would have to ensure that they are building upward linkages with the district, with the state authority for, the success of their plan, both, financially as well as from a capacity standpoint.
Thank you, Jaya. One last question from Malini Krishnan Kuti. She says, thanks for sharing WRI's experiences. One question is, what can cities learn from each other? For example, are there any lessons for bigger cities to learn from smaller ones? I had that question as well, in fact.
Yeah, no, so absolutely. I think there are many things, and the whole value of peer-to-peer learning, the whole value of peer-to-peer learning is this, that how do you, because the small cities, the medium cities are going to be the big cities of the future, right? When you look at Mumbai or Bangalore, at some point, decades ago, they were actually small cities. They evolved into medium-sized cities, and then they became these really ginormous cities. And Bangalore actually not so long ago, in memory. So the whole idea is that what can these cities learn from each other to ensure that they avoid the pitfalls or the mistakes that these large cities have made? And similarly, what can large cities learn in terms of ownership, community engagement, how to do that better, how to create that whole sense of place? I think those are the things that the large cities can learn from small cities. So peer learning, and I think both ways is extremely important. there might be also important sort of governance and leadership lessons that large cities can learn from small cities, and the other way around.
Absolutely. I'd like to invite my colleague Pushpa Pathak to please share her thoughts. She works on medium-sized cities. Would you like to share any thoughts, Pushpa, on learnings from medium-sized cities, small towns and medium-sized cities?
I was keeping quiet because I have a cold. I have a bad cold, and I'm coughing. So I was very impressed with the talk by Jaya, and but I'm also distressed because this kind of action plans. Similarly, we had heard another disaster mitigation or identification of climate sensitive areas. They are so effort, money, data intensive. I wonder if their implementation is giving value. So I didn't want to make this skeptical comment right in the beginning, but maybe if you want, you could respond to that. But it's a very big question. It's not just your presentation. NIU is making a whole lot of plans. Other institutions are making plans with some other cities. So we have layers of planning and different kinds of action plans. And do they get implemented? Do they add value on the ground? It's a question. On the small and medium towns, I think learning both ways goes on, and there are certain platforms for it. People like National Institute of Urban Affairs, Indian Institute of Public Administration do bring these different size cities and enable interaction with them. I was at IIPA last week chairing a session on urban economy and poverty, and there were a whole lot of government officials from states, districts, and local level, and there was a lot of exchange between them. So there is learning, but I think there is very little learning from small towns to larger cities. I think there is a hierarchical structure of learning, and one assumes small and medium towns can learn more from larger cities. So there is this kind of bias. I'm not sure whether it's valid or not. Thank you, Champaka.
Thank you, Pushpa. Those were great insights and big questions for us to think about and advance in terms of solutions as we move forward. Jaya, any concluding thoughts from you? Otherwise, it's just a whole lot of appreciation for your talk. I should just reiterate that.
No, thank you very much, Champaka and Pushpa. Very important questions that you've laid out. And yes, absolutely. I think in our plans, in our policies, in the ways that Indian cities function, there is definitely a big city bias, in many things, and that's there. And that's the kind of cycle that we need to break, and kind of through some of these exercise show what can be, what are the learnings that can go in the other direction. Just the last thing that I would add is, in terms of this being perceived as an onerous exercise, which it was. I mean, I will not, make light of it. I also see my colleagues Avni and Bhanu who have joined, who were integral part of all of these exercises, and the amount of effort that has gone into this. Bhanu basically held down the entire sort of data piece on a lot of this. Avni was responsible for a lot of the climate budgeting work, the climate action plan that happened in Mumbai, and then subsequently in other places in Maharashtra. So just to say that this was no mean feat. I think we were dealing with two things. One was that how do you bring, science to something which previously has just been reactive, right? So you have just seen, you've done disaster management, those agencies exist. Their approach is rescue and recovery. You're just looking at after things are done, how do you deal with rebuilding? But the whole point was, how do you bring the resilience and the preparedness lens to this? and what is a scientific way in which you can place the evidence to say that this is important, this is needed, right? So these exercises were onerous, and yes, there is elegance and simplicity, and that is what we should aim for the kind of the population that we have to target, and also the kind of capacities that we have in our cities. I think there is a temptation to do this. Sometimes all of these plans and to create these templates to address the scale issue, because you're dealing with a huge number of people, large population. How can you create something which gets to scale quickly? But we have also realized that in many cases, and especially in the case of adaptation, scale may not be quick to come, and that's okay, as long as you're building the awareness, as long as you're building the evidence and the awareness to be able to let communities take action on their own. So I would say, the data and the evidence exercise is really for that. It is to build the awareness. I mean, it shouldn't stop at that, right? I mean, it's not like you've done these numbers and the maths and that's it. The whole point is, how do you take this out? How do you make visible all of this data and all of this evidence so that people can take informed actions? Again, those may not be the optimal actions. They may not be the right actions, but at least they're informed actions. And that is the endeavor. So yes, I think ideally what we would like to do is see if there are more sort of elegant ways to take these tools and to simplify them in ways that larger portions of our communities can use them. But overall, I would say that this whole exercise across the 4 climate action plans partners still going on has been extremely, rewarding, and some of the ground truths that we have sort of unveiled and unpacked, revealed through this process, just bringing together different authorities in a room to be able to talk to each other, to enable those negotiations, I think itself has been a big step. So I would say, from a governance standpoint, through these informal mechanisms, the CAP has achieved a lot in these cities. And yeah, that's where I'll leave it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jaya. We've overshot time, and really many thanks to all the participants who've so enthusiastically stayed on all the way until now. I think it's a great moment to sort of conclude the session by saying, to sort of reiterate the point you made earlier, Jaya, that what needs to happen is to sort of, the disaggregation of these plans, the methods that are used, and sort of democratization of this planning approach and this planning process for climate action planning and for disaster management at local levels. And locally drawn innovations and solutions would become more and more crucial as we face multiple crises and profound crises in the years to come. Thank you very much again for taking the time out to share with us all the amazing work you've been doing, you and your teams. And we hope to engage with you in the future as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Champaka.
Thank you. Thanks to all the participants for being here.